November 8, 1942. The cold waters of the Mediterranean slapped against steel hulls as the first waves of American troops closed in on the beaches of Algeria. Operation Torch, the opening act of America's ground war in Europe, was about to begin. For many of these young soldiers, it was their first taste of combat. Fear gnawed at their stomachs, rifles felt heavier than ever, and the uncertainty of what awaited them on shore hung thick in the air. Yet hidden in the crates lashed to their landing craft was a weapon few of them had even seen, let alone fired. Its official designation was the M1 rocket launcher, but within weeks it would become famous under a very different name, the bazooka. It hardly looked like the tool of victory, just a hollow steel tube, barely longer than the man carrying it, weighing 13 pounds at most. To the untrained eye, it seemed crude, closer to a plumber's pipe than a battlefield innovation. Yet this simple contraption, built for less than the cost of a factory worker's monthly wage, would change the mathematics of war. In those crates, stacked alongside ammunition boxes and medical supplies, lay the power to transform the American infantryman from tank prey into tank hunter. Only months earlier, the bazooka had existed as little more than a desperate experiment at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. In May 1942, Colonel Leslie Skinner and Lieutenant Edward Oule had arrived with an improvised launcher cobbled together from spare parts. The sight was laughable. A steel tube salvaged from a junk pile, a crude set of sights bent from a coat hanger, and a trigger assembly that looked suspiciously like it had been lifted from a doorbell. Even Oule himself admitted he wore a welder's mask for the first test, fearing the contraption might explode in his face. But when that rocket hissed out of the barrel and slammed into the side of a tank, onlookers stopped laughing. In a matter of seconds, the crude invention had outperformed every heavyweight anti-tank design the Army had hauled onto the range. The landings at Sidi Ferruch Beach tested the weapon under the harshest circumstances. Soldiers tore open the crates while under fire, fumbling with tubes, wires, and rockets they had never handled before. Reports from the 1st Infantry Division described chaos as men struggled to assemble the launchers on the spot. Some rockets misfired, damaged by saltwater during the voyage. Others exploded prematurely, leaving scorched hands and rattled nerves. The men cursed the strange contraption, but desperation drove them to keep trying. Amid confusion and casualties, the bazooka began to speak for itself. On November 10th, just 2 days after the landings, anti-tank teams of the 1st Armored Division engaged Vichy French Renault tanks near Port Lyautey. Incredibly, despite having figured out the weapon by trial and error, American soldiers managed to knock out 2 tanks. One after-action note summed it up plainly: weapon effective when functioning properly. Crude as that assessment may sound, it marked the dawn of a new era. The bazooka had drawn first blood. But war is never one-sided, and the Germans learned quickly. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, Rommel's Afrika Korps swept through poorly prepared American lines, capturing vast amounts of equipment. Among the loot were intact bazookas and cases of rockets. Within weeks, German engineers at Kummersdorf were dissecting the launchers. Their reports, now preserved in the Bundesarchiv, were blunt. This was a simple, devastatingly practical solution to infantry anti-tank needs. By September, Germany's copy, the Raketenpanzerbuch 43, better known as the Panzerschreck, was rolling off assembly lines. Larger, with an 88 warhead, it could pierce thicker armor than the American original. Even so, the Germans faced a problem the Americans had already solved: production. The Panzerschreck cost more, took longer to build, and required better trained crews to operate safely. The bazooka, by contrast, could be made for just $25, with rockets at $8 each. Any soldier with barely an afternoon of instruction could use it effectively. This was the quiet genius of the design. It democratized anti-tank warfare. Infantrymen no longer had to wait for heavy guns or tank support. They could carry battlefield power in their own hands. The Sicily campaign in July 1943 proved just how much had changed. The improved M1A1 bazooka arrived with sturdier wiring and a more reliable rocket. Near Biscari, an airborne bazooka team from the 82nd Division achieved an extraordinary hit on a Tiger tank, striking through the driver's vision port. Though such precision was rare, the The mere possibility sent shockwaves through German command. A war diary entry from the Hermann Göring Panzer Division captured the mood. Enemy infantry equipped with rocket weapons capable of destroying armor at close range. Tank commanders must exercise caution in urban fighting. Colonel James Gavin of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment later wrote, "The bazooka has given our men confidence against tanks." That confidence was priceless. No longer did infantry scatter in panic at the sight of armor. With a tube slung over their shoulder, they became hunters rather than prey. By the fall of 1943, the bazooka was no longer an experiment rushed into battle. It had matured into a standard weapon of war, issued to every American battalion. Production surged to 20,000 launchers a month, with new designs such as the M9 incorporating improvements like magneto ignition and a two-piece breakdown for paratroopers. With these refinements, the bazooka became as common as the rifle or the machine gun, a fixture of American squads pushing through Italy's mountains and villages. The Italian campaign revealed just how versatile the weapon could be. Towns built from stone and narrow streets turned into death traps for conventional armor. Bazooka teams adapted quickly, blasting holes through walls instead of risking exposure in open alleys. Canadian diaries from the fighting at Ortona recorded admiration for the American launcher, noting its effectiveness not just against tanks, but against fortified houses. For soldiers clawing their way through medieval towns, the bazooka became a universal problem solver, as useful against bunkers and machine gun nests as it was against steel armor. The Germans, forced to adapt, rewrote their doctrine. Training directives ordered tanks to avoid advancing without close infantry support. Buildings had to be cleared before armor moved in. Side skirts and extra track links were welded to hulls in a desperate attempt at improvised protection. Even the distinctive Zimmerit paste, designed to prevent magnetic charges, was part of a broader reaction to the growing threat of infantry-held anti-tank weapons. What had once been lightning-fast blitzkrieg tactics slowed to methodical crawls. The element of shock, the heart of German armored warfare, was eroding under the shadow of a cheap American tube. When Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, thousands of bazooka teams came ashore with them. In the hedgerows of Normandy, the weapon found a battlefield made for ambush. German tanks that had once roamed with impunity now hesitated, aware that behind every hedge might lurk a two-man team ready to strike. Reports from the First Army show that in the weeks following D-Day, bazookas accounted for 12% of German armored losses in the American sector, a remarkable figure given the number of other weapons in play. Still, it was not without limits. The German Panzerschreck, with its heavier warhead, could punch deeper holes through armor than the American design. But it was cumbersome, expensive, and hazardous to its own crew due to its fierce backblast. The bazooka remained lighter, faster to produce, and far more portable. In industrial warfare, those differences mattered more than technical superiority. By the end of 1944, American factories had produced nearly 500,000 launchers, overwhelming German production despite their best efforts to imitate. For infantrymen, the psychological shift was profound. Gone were the days when the appearance of a tank signaled hopelessness. With a bazooka in the squad, even teenagers fresh from training camps felt they had a fighting chance. That change in morale, invisible on charts and statistics, was every bit as decisive as the rockets themselves. The bitter winter of 1944 put the bazooka through its hardest trial yet. In the forests of the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, American soldiers faced the full weight of Hitler's last gamble. Panther and Tiger tanks pressed forward through snow-covered villages, while GIs dug into frozen earth, their breath rising in clouds as they clutched the only weapon that gave them a chance to stop the steel monsters. The cold played cruel tricks. Batteries in older M1A1 models froze, forcing men to warm them inside their jackets. Rockets burned unpredictably, their range shortened by sub-zero temperatures. Yet even under those brutal conditions, the bazooka proved its worth. Technical Sergeant Donald Bracken of the 394th Infantry Regiment recalled destroying a Panther near Rocherath with a single well-aimed shot to the rear engine deck. Other accounts describe teams stalking tanks through snowdrifts, camouflaged in white, waiting for the right moment to strike. In total, American records credit bazooka teams with disabling or destroying nearly 90 German armored vehicles during the Ardennes campaign. For a weapon born from scrap parts and coat hanger sights, it was an astonishing legacy. Innovation didn't stop in the trenches. Major Charles Carpenter, an artillery officer with the 4th Armored Division, gained fame by mounting 6 bazookas on the wings of his light reconnaissance aircraft. Nicknamed Bazooka Charlie, he dove on German tanks from the skies, firing rockets at close range and achieving confirmed kills. His daring exploits, part ingenuity and part madness, demonstrated just how adaptable the weapon could be. The bazooka was no longer confined to foxholes, it had taken to the air. By this stage of the war, the statistics spoke for themselves. Army Ordnance reports documented nearly 500,000 launchers produced and more than 15 million rockets fired. Compared to the cost of deploying tanks, artillery, or aircraft, the bazooka offered a staggering economic advantage. For roughly $110, enough to cover 1 launcher and 10 rockets, an infantry team could neutralize a tank that had cost Germany the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars to build. The economics of destruction were firmly on America's side. For the Germans, the psychological toll was immense. War diaries captured their growing anxiety. Tanks no longer dared to advance into towns without infantry clearing the way. Crews welded extra armor plates, sandbags, and spare track links to their vehicles. Every ruined building or hedgerow was treated as a potential ambush. Blitzkrieg, the swift armored thrust that had conquered half of Europe, was now smothered by the ever-present threat of hidden bazooka teams. Even as American forces advanced into Germany in 1945, the bazooka continued to evolve. The lightweight M18, made from aluminum, was introduced just before war's end. Although only a few hundred saw combat, its design hinted at the future of portable rocket weapons. What began as a hasty invention had by now become a defining feature of modern warfare. Infantrymen armed with the power to bring down the most formidable machines on the battlefield. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the bazooka had already etched its place in history. Nearly 500,000 launchers and over 15 million rockets had rolled off American production lines. From Sicily to Normandy, from the mountains of Italy to the frozen forests of Belgium, the weapon had proven itself not only as a tool of destruction, but as a symbol of ingenuity. It was the simplest of designs, little more than a steel tube and a firing mechanism, yet it had forced one of the most advanced armies in the world to rewrite its entire doctrine. German officers later admitted that the appearance of portable rocket launchers had nullified the very foundations of blitzkrieg. Armor could no longer operate alone. Every advance demanded infantry screens, caution, and time. Speed had given way to fear. Captured German documents confirm this shift. Orders warned tank commanders never to enter built-up areas without support, demanded constant vigilance in hedgerows, and recommended improvised defenses like side skirts, welded tracks, and concrete slabs. Even the famed Tiger, once the terror of Allied forces, found itself vulnerable to a 2-man team hiding in rubble. The bazooka had changed not just the battlefield, but the psychology of war. For the first time, the ordinary foot soldier could look at a tank and know he had a weapon capable of evening the odds. That knowledge transformed morale across the American army. Soldiers no longer scattered in panic at the growl of engines. Instead, they dug in, waited, and prepared to strike. The influence of the weapon spread far beyond Europe. In the Pacific, Marines used bazookas to crack open Japanese bunkers and cave fortifications. At Iwo Jima, records show nearly 2,000 rockets fired in a single division during the fighting. White phosphorus rounds turned caves into furnaces, and high-explosive rockets tore apart pillboxes that artillery had struggled to silence. Later in Korea, the original M9A1 proved inadequate against Soviet-built T-34s, but the quick arrival of the larger 3.5-inch Super Bazooka restored balance. Once again, an infantryman could stop a tank with a single shot. The principle remained unchanged. Simplicity, portability, and mass production gave power to the soldier. Even decades later, the legacy of Eisenhower's tool of victory was visible in every army on Earth. The Soviet RPG, the American Law, the Swedish Carl Gustaf, all were descendants of the same concept. What began as Lieutenant Edward Uhl's improvised launcher, cobbled together with scrap metal and coat hanger sights, had sparked a revolution in military thought. The bazooka proved that modern warfare would not be won solely by giant tanks or massive guns, but by equipping the common soldier with weapons that were cheap, effective, and endlessly adaptable. It was, in many ways, democracy in steel. Free workers in American factories had built them by the hundreds of thousands. Ordinary soldiers had carried them across continents, and together they had forced the Reich's most fearsome weapons to a halt. The Germans were indeed shocked not by complexity, but by simplicity. A humble tube costing less than a bicycle had humbled the panzer divisions of Hitler's empire. And in that transformation lay a larger truth. In an industrial war, it is not the most sophisticated weapon that decides victory, but the one that can be produced in numbers, placed in the hands of citizens, and carried into battle by the thousands. The bazooka embodied that truth, Eisenhower's tool of victory, a weapon that gave courage to soldiers and reshaped the course of history. The impact was immediate. General Glaydon Barnes, head of Army Research and Engineering, examined the odd little launcher and reportedly chuckled, "Looks like Bob Burns's bazooka." The name stuck. Within minutes, orders for thousands of units were approved, and American industry roared to life. By October of that same year, General Electric and a handful of contractors were producing 5,000 launchers per month, a feat of speed and efficiency that reflected the broader American war machine's ability to turn improvisation into mass production almost overnight. Yet for the men clutching those crates on their way to Sidi Ferruch Beach, the weapon was still a mystery. Marked Secret, the launchers had been delivered without manuals, without instruction, without so much as a demonstration. Eisenhower himself, reviewing the invasion preparations, was stunned to discover his troops carried a revolutionary weapon with no training on how to use it. The irony was brutal. A device meant to empower the infantry might just become dead weight when the first shots were fired.